This story is inspired by the real case of Don Kemp, 1982, Wyoming, USA. It was a freezing November morning in 1982 when a state trooper noticed a peculiar sight along a desolate highway in Wyoming. A green Chevrolet Blazer sat idling on the shoulder, engine humming quietly under the falling snow. But the scene was far from ordinary. The driver's door was ajar, and there was no one in sight. Inside the SUV were signs of a life suddenly paused. Don Kemp's briefcase, a thermos of hot coffee, and his untouched clothes folded neatly. It was as if he had simply stepped out and never returned. Don Kemp wasn't just any traveler. He was a successful advertising executive from New York, known for his sharp intellect and creative flair. After a near-fatal car accident years earlier, Kemp had left behind the fast-paced corporate world in search of something deeper, something meaningful. Friends said he had grown increasingly introspective, studying history and mysticism, planning to write a book that connected ancient ideas to the modern world. In a moment of reinvention, he packed his belongings and set off westward in pursuit of clarity. Wyoming was supposed to be a stop on that journey, but instead, it became the end of his trail. The day before his disappearance, Don had checked out of a museum in Cheyenne, leaving behind a suitcase filled with strange items, candles, a pile of old books, and a note that no one could quite decipher. Hours later, his vehicle would be found more than 40 miles away, inexplicably abandoned on a remote road. Tracks in the snow led away from the SUV and toward a distant field, ultimately vanishing near an old barn. Investigators followed them to the structure, where they discovered 3 of Don's socks, a pair of shoes, and a pile of logs stacked as if someone had tried to start a fire. But there was no sign of Don himself. No blood, no struggle, no body. Just silence and snow. As hours turned into days and days into weeks, law enforcement scoured the surrounding area. Helicopters flew overhead. Search dogs combed the frozen fields. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder across miles of emptiness. Yet nothing new emerged. The barn, with its eerie stillness and abandoned items, became the focal point of the mystery. Who walks barefoot into a Wyoming winter? Where had Don gone in the bitter cold? And why? Meanwhile, Don's mother, Mary Kemp, became the torchbearer of the search. A devout woman with a fierce determination, she refused to believe her son had perished in that field. Then, something even more unsettling happened. Months after the disappearance, Mary began receiving strange phone calls, always from someone who sounded eerily like Don. The man on the line refused to identify himself but asked cryptic questions about Don's case. When the calls were traced, they led to a house in Casper, Wyoming, an address linked to a man Don had allegedly met shortly before he vanished. The deeper one looked, the stranger the case became. Was Don Kemp the victim of foul play, or had he chosen to disappear? Some theorized he suffered a breakdown, driven by spiritual obsession. Others believed he stumbled upon something, or someone, he shouldn't have. All that remained at the time was a mystery etched in snow, a man's shadow walking barefoot into oblivion. The voice on the phone was calm, almost rehearsed. Mary Kemp, exhausted from months of waiting and worn down by grief, recognized the cadence immediately. "Is Don there?" the man asked in one call. "You should stop looking," he whispered in another. The number was traced to a man named Mark Dennis, a casual acquaintance of Don's who lived in Casper, Wyoming. When questioned, Dennis admitted that Don had stayed with him briefly before the disappearance, but he denied making the calls. He even passed a lie detector test. Still, doubts lingered. Why had Don sought out Dennis? Why would a grieving mother receive phone calls from someone impersonating, or possibly being, her son? And how could it all tie back to the isolated barn and the footprints in the snow? Investigators hit a wall. No physical evidence linked anyone to a crime, and no body had been found. The Wyoming wilderness, vast and indifferent, seemed to have swallowed Don whole. Yet for Mary, the case remained painfully alive. She launched her own investigation, traveling back and forth between her home in New York and the West. She knocked on doors, questioned locals, and revisited the barn where her son's trail had ended. She carried Don's photograph in her purse like a passport to the truth. "This isn't over," she'd tell reporters. "Not until I have an answer." And then, in 1985, 3 years after Don's disappearance, the unthinkable happened. Human remains were found just a few hundred yards from the very barn that had been searched repeatedly by professionals and volunteers alike. A hunter had stumbled upon a skull, partially buried in grass. The surrounding bones showed no signs of trauma, and strangely, the clothing nearby matched what Don had been wearing. Dental records confirmed the impossible. Don Kemp had been there all along. The same place investigators had combed multiple times had concealed his final resting place. Authorities ruled out foul play. There were no fractures, no bullet wounds, no weapons. The official theory was that Don had wandered from his vehicle into the cold and died of exposure, succumbing to the elements. Case closed. But to Mary and many others, that conclusion raised more questions than it answered. How had trained teams missed a body so close to their search radius? Why had someone made those eerie phone calls long after Don was supposedly dead? And how could a man so determined to find truth disappear under such baffling circumstances? Theories multiplied. Some suggested Don had experienced a psychological break and wandered into the wild in a state of delirium. Others claimed he faked his own death, only to meet a grim fate when survival turned impossible. A few entertained even more elaborate ideas, that Don had uncovered something dangerous or forbidden, that led others to silence him. The absence of concrete answers kept the speculation alive. The barn, once just a structure on an empty plain, became a totem of unanswered prayers. Don's story seeped into local legend, whispered about in hushed tones by those who remembered the winter when a man walked into the snow and vanished. Yet perhaps the most chilling detail is this. Don Kemp's body lay hidden in a field already searched, in a space already passed through by dozens of eyes. If death had taken him that day in 1982, how could he have made calls months later? Was it all a trick? A cruel coincidence? Or had someone known more than they ever confessed? In the years that followed the discovery of Don Kemp's remains, the haunting contradictions in his case refused to settle. For many, the most unnerving element wasn't just his mysterious disappearance, it was the timeline that didn't make sense. Phone calls placed months after he was presumed dead. Footprints that led to nowhere. Remains discovered in a field that had already been combed over. The simplest explanation, that Don wandered off and froze to death, just didn't satisfy the glaring gaps. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the final weeks of Don's life remain an invisible stretch of time, filled with more speculation than certainty. Don had never expressed suicidal thoughts. Quite the opposite. Friends described him as focused, idealistic, even spiritually ambitious. He was writing a book. He had a plan. His trip west wasn't an escape from life, but a pursuit of understanding. He had told several people he was onto something, some connection between ancient symbols, historical truths, and the way modern society operated. His ideas were vague to others, but intensely vivid to him. He believed there was a hidden layer beneath the world, and that he could reveal it. Some dismissed this as the rantings of a man recovering from trauma. Don's car accident had left him physically injured and emotionally shaken. A long hospital stay and chronic pain had changed his outlook. He withdrew from the advertising world and began corresponding with scholars, ordering obscure texts, studying alone in his apartment. He sold off most of his possessions and gave away his furniture. This wasn't a mental breakdown. It was a transformation. He wanted less noise, less artifice. That's what drew him to the West. Its silence, its vastness, its spiritual history, which makes the state of his vehicle even more strange. Why would Don leave it running, in perfect condition, with the door open and the keys in the ignition? If he intended to explore, why not turn off the engine? Why not lock the doors? Why not take warmer clothing? Instead, everything was left behind, including 3 handwritten letters addressed to friends, later found in the glove box. None of them mentioned any kind of distress. They were reflective, yes, but optimistic. Don seemed excited for what lay ahead. The idea that he simply wandered off and froze doesn't explain the layers of strangeness that followed. The socks in the barn, the logs arranged for a fire, the lack of footprints returning to the vehicle, the fact that no animals had disturbed the remains in 3 years. If Don died nearby, exposed and alone, his body should have been visible during the initial search. But it wasn't. Some theorized he had hidden himself, perhaps injured or ashamed. Others believed he had been moved, either by nature or by someone else. But who? Mark Dennis, the man tied to the phone calls, faded from the public narrative, but not from Mary Kemp's suspicion. She remained convinced that he knew more than he said. She wrote letters to law enforcement, reporters, even psychics, trying to stir the waters of truth. But nothing more surfaced, just the static of time and the growing myth of Don Kemp. As the years passed, the case drifted from headlines and entered a darker realm, that of American folklore. Don became more than a man. He became a question. The barn, the car, the snow-covered plains, each element added to a puzzle that refused resolution. Every small detail seemed to echo something larger, like the whispers of a story unfinished. For Mary Kemp, the mystery of her son's disappearance became a private war against forgetting. She couldn't rest, not when every thread she pulled seemed to reveal another knot. She often replayed the last conversation she had with Don. He had sounded hopeful, even peaceful, telling her that his journey west was exactly what he needed. There was no warning, no cryptic farewell. Just an ordinary goodbye from a man seeking something extraordinary. But as time passed and the official investigation grew colder, Mary refused to let the narrative close on bureaucratic terms. She wanted truth, not closure. She returned to Wyoming multiple times, often standing alone in that open field, staring at the barn that had swallowed her son's final steps. Locals began to recognize her, whispering about the woman from New York who still believed there was more to the story. Some were sympathetic. Others warned her not to dig too deep. Wyoming was a place of long silences and buried secrets. People lived far apart for a reason. And yet, in every cafe and roadside diner, there was always someone with a theory. One elderly man told her about strange lights he'd seen in the sky the night Don vanished, blue orbs dancing above the trees near South Pass. Another claimed the barn had once belonged to a reclusive trapper who was rumored to have died decades ago, though no record of his death was ever found. Others mentioned Native American burial grounds nearby, suggesting Don may have trespassed onto spiritually charged land. These weren't just ghost stories. In a place as remote and raw as Wyoming, the line between folklore and fact often blurred. Mary, though deeply religious, began to consider possibilities she once would have dismissed. She met with a shaman who told her that Don's energy was still present in the valley, that his spirit had not yet moved on. A psychic, unprompted, described a vision of Don kneeling barefoot in the snow, praying. These visions, while unverifiable, gave Mary something that the sheriff's office never could: the sense that her son's disappearance mattered to something greater than paperwork. What troubled her most were the letters Don had written shortly before vanishing. In one, he spoke of finally seeing the path. In another, he hinted at a place where silence speaks louder than words. These poetic fragments felt more like riddles than farewells. They convinced Mary that Don hadn't simply lost his way. He had followed something, perhaps too far. But what that something was remained undefined. A vision? a purpose, or a person? And always, the phone calls lingered in her memory. They were too specific, too timely. Once, the man on the line had said, "Don's not here anymore. Stop looking." She could never forget the tone of that voice. Emotionless, hollow, calculated. Who had spoken those words? And why call at all if the case was merely about a man who wandered off and died? More than anything, Mary feared that Don's story would be flattened into a tragic but simple statistic. That people would remember him only as the man who froze to death in Wyoming, ignoring the tangled web of signs, symbols, and contradictions he left behind. She knew there was more. She could feel it, like a pulse underneath the earth, stubborn and rhythmic. Something had happened out there, something no autopsy or case file could explain. Years after Don's remains were discovered, and long after the public had moved on, fragments of the case continued to surface, like bones slowly unearthed by shifting wind. Amateur sleuths began to dissect every document available, from police reports to newspaper clippings, hunting for overlooked inconsistencies. One retired detective from Montana even published a self-funded booklet titled The Don Kemp Discrepancy, outlining all the things that didn't add up. The condition of the car, the unlikelihood of someone walking barefoot for miles in sub-zero weather, and of course, the infamous phone calls. In the court of public curiosity, Don Kemp's story wasn't closed. It had just entered its next phase: obsession. Among the most perplexing new discoveries was an overlooked witness statement. A trucker named Joel Banning had reported seeing a man matching Don's description several miles away from the barn, 4 days after the vehicle was discovered. The man, he said, was barefoot, wrapped in a blanket, and stumbling through the snow near a frozen creek bed. But Joel hadn't stopped. It was early morning, and visibility was poor. He assumed the man was either drunk or mentally ill. He didn't think to alert the authorities until months later, when he read about the case in a magazine. By then, the search had long ended, and no one followed up. Other accounts came from towns along the interstate, sightings of a confused man asking for directions, loitering near convenience stores, always alone. One gas station attendant even claimed the man had asked for a map and then walked away without buying anything. These were never verified, but they added a haunting suggestion. What if Don didn't die right away? What if he wandered for days, slipping in and out of civilization, ghost-like, unseen except in passing glances? The idea chilled those who entertained it. It meant he might have suffered longer than anyone had thought. Or perhaps he was searching for something or someone until the very end. And then there was the barn itself, which had become a macabre landmark. True crime podcasters visited the site and filmed episodes among its decaying beams. Paranormal investigators arrived with EMF meters and thermal cameras. Some claimed to hear faint whispering in the wind, or catch flickers of movement in their peripheral vision. The location's aura of quiet desolation had only deepened. One podcaster described it as a place that doesn't want to give up its secrets. Over time, a cult-like fascination developed around the case. Online forums debated every detail, from the boot prints in the snow to the esoteric symbols found among Don's personal items. Some users even tried to recreate Don's final route, documenting every stop and photographing every site mentioned in police records. Still, no new breakthroughs emerged, just more theories, more layers, more questions. Was Don Kemp trying to disappear, or was he trying to be found? Had he stepped into a spiritual journey that ended in tragedy, or was he silenced by someone he trusted? In either case, the story carried the heavy weight of unfinished business. For many, it became less about what happened, and more about why no one had stopped it from happening. A man in search of truth had walked into the wild, only to vanish under circumstances too strange to explain, and too specific to ignore. As the years turned into decades, the mystery surrounding Don Kemp became something more than a cold case. It became a cautionary tale whispered on fringe forums, a modern myth born in the lonely emptiness of the American West. His story attracted not just investigators or grieving family members, but also those drawn to the edges of reality: mystics, conspiracy theorists, and spiritual seekers. Each group saw in Don's disappearance a reflection of their own beliefs. Some believed he had been taken by a secret organization, by forces unknown, or by the wilderness itself. Others believed he had ascended to a higher plane, leaving only physical clues behind. But Mary Kemp never stopped insisting on something simpler: that her son had met with someone in that field, and that someone had never come forward. Mary passed away before any answers emerged, but before her death, she compiled a collection of Don's writings, journal entries, letters, sketches, and self-published them under the title Whispers from the Edge. The book gained a small cult following, especially among readers fascinated by Don's growing interest in metaphysical theories. He wrote about ancient civilizations, astral projection, ley lines, and the thin boundaries between consciousness and death. Some passages read like spiritual epiphanies, others hinted at paranoia, mentions of being followed, of feeling watched in hotel rooms, of a sense that something had been set in motion. One entry, dated just days before he vanished, read simply, "The door is almost open. I just have to walk through it." Readers debated whether Don was unraveling or awakening. His mind, it seemed, had been in two places at once, rooted in reality, but pulling towards something unexplainable. Mary, for her part, believed her son had been on the brink of a discovery, something powerful enough that it cost him his life. She believed he had trusted the wrong person, perhaps shared too much, and once he vanished, someone had worked quietly to erase the traces. But erasing Don Kemp entirely proved impossible. His name would resurface again and again, attached to lists of unsolved mysteries, to episodes of paranormal TV shows, to YouTube documentaries that drew millions of curious viewers. His image, handsome, thoughtful, slightly distant, became iconic among the strange and unexplained. Still, with all the fascination, no new evidence ever emerged. The barn stood as a silent witness. The car had long been destroyed. The phone calls remained untraceable beyond the dead end of Mark Dennis, who vanished from the public eye entirely, never interviewed again. And then, curiously, came a letter. In 2002, a journalist investigating the case received an anonymous envelope postmarked from New Mexico. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It showed a man seated at a diner counter seen from behind. His hair was graying, his shoulders slouched, but the profile, it resembled Don Kemp. Scribbled on the back were the words, "Some doors stay open." For many, it was nothing, a hoax, a distraction. But others saw it as the final twist of a story that had defied logic from the start. Was Don Kemp still alive? Had he staged his death and escaped into obscurity? Or was this just one last fragment meant to torment those still listening? Whatever the truth, Don's story refused to rest. It lingered in the collective imagination like an unfinished sentence. The man who once lived among Manhattan skyscrapers had gone in search of something ancient, something silent, and he may have found it in the most brutal and beautiful way. Long after official interest had faded, a new generation began to rediscover Don Kemp's story, not through newspapers or police archives, but through the digital underground of the internet. Podcasts, Reddit threads, and late-night YouTube rabbit holes kept the mystery alive. Each retelling added more layers, more speculation, and more eerie synchronicities. In many ways, the mystery had evolved beyond Don himself. He had become a cipher for those fascinated by the thin veil between the rationale and the inexplicable. His life, and especially his disappearance, acted as a mirror, reflecting our deepest fear, that someone could simply vanish, leaving only clues that make less sense the closer you look. What particularly intrigued digital investigators was how calculated some of Don's final movements appeared. The museum in Cheyenne, where he left a suitcase full of esoteric books and ceremonial candles, felt staged, as if he were sending a message. Some of the texts were on ancient rituals and death rites. One book had passages underlined about spiritual transition and liminal spaces. These weren't random items. They were deliberately chosen, left like breadcrumbs. Why? One Redditor, an amateur symbologist, noted that the barn where Don's belongings were found was situated almost precisely on a ley line. Theoretical energy currents, some believe, connect sacred sites across the world. Another theorist pointed out that November 16th, the day Don's vehicle was discovered, aligned with a rare astrological conjunction tied to revelation and transformation. These weren't coincidences, they argued. Don had planned this journey like a ritual, a crossing into something beyond. But if he had planned it, why leave so chaotically? Why abandon a warm vehicle, carrying letters of hope and plans for the future? That's where the darker theories re-enter. Some believe Don met someone who exploited his beliefs, someone who lured him deeper into isolation under the guise of enlightenment. A charismatic manipulator, perhaps, or an organized group. The idea of cult involvement emerged, though no evidence ever confirmed it. Others leaned toward psychological explanations, a dissociative break triggered by years of trauma, isolation, and metaphysical obsession. But even then, how to explain the calls, the movements, the man seen wrapped in a blanket days after he disappeared? The mystery continued to ripple outward, attracting those drawn to patterns, anomalies, and half-truths. A filmmaker attempted a documentary but pulled the plug mid-production, reportedly unsettled by the interviews he'd conducted. A journalist received a package with Don's face circled in red ink on old magazine pages. No return address, no explanation. The case didn't just resist closure. It infected those who tried to close it. Perhaps that's why the story endured. Unlike most cold cases, Don Kemp's disappearance seemed to breathe. It changed depending on who told it. To some, it was a spiritual journey interrupted. To others, a warning about obsession and isolation. To his mother, it was a life stolen too soon. But to everyone else, it remained a ghost story without the comfort of the supernatural. A real man, in a real place, surrounded by real signs. And still, nothing certain. And through it all, the question remained unanswered. Did Don Kemp vanish because of something within him, or because of something he found? In the final analysis, if there can ever truly be one, the case of Don Kemp sits at a strange intersection of time, place, and meaning. It begins like a tragedy, unfolds like a thriller, and ends like folklore. There are no smoking guns, no definitive confessions, just a scattering of clues like bones on a prairie, forever resisting arrangement. Don was not a criminal, not a fugitive, not even a recluse. He was a man in transition, caught between two worlds, one of logic and advertising, and one of silence and spirit. What he was looking for may have been impossible to find, but he walked into the snow to try anyway. That image, the SUV idling on the side of the road, the door left open, a thermos still warm, haunts anyone who revisits the case. It feels like a moment frozen in time, as if the story itself is inviting you to step inside and finish it. Even the barn, now collapsed and weather-beaten, still draws the occasional traveler. Some come out of curiosity. Others come quietly, placing objects where Don's belongings were once found. A single candle, a folded sock, an old book, as if honoring a ritual they don't fully understand. In the end, the unanswered questions don't diminish Don's story. They define it. The facts are simple. A man drove into Wyoming and disappeared. His remains were found years later, within sight of where his journey ended. But everything around those facts, the strange phone calls, the spiritual overtones, the eerie consistencies and inconsistencies, make the case impossible to dismiss as random or accidental. It demands interpretation. It refuses to be labeled. And maybe that's the legacy Don Kemp unknowingly created. A space for contemplation. His life, brief but rich with intention, became a canvas for others to project their fears, beliefs, and curiosities. In a world obsessed with data and evidence, his story is a rare reminder that some truths remain just out of reach. Not because they're hidden, but because they were never meant to be explained in the first place. For those closest to him, especially Mary, the pain of not knowing was the deepest wound. But even she came to believe that her son had walked into something larger than death, something timeless. "Don was always looking for meaning," she once said in an interview. "I just hope he found it." Today, Don's story endures not because it offers closure, but because it resists it. He is remembered not as a victim, but as a seeker, a man who followed the thread of his own mystery, even when it led into the cold, unforgiving wild. So if you ever find yourself driving along that stretch of empty Wyoming highway, and you see a weathered sign pointing toward nothing at all, remember Don Kemp, a man who vanished, not into thin air, but into the blank spaces of his own unanswered questions.